Welcome to the Bible Made Clear. Once again, I'm here with my friend Herb Butterworth, and we're going to do a question answer routine again. I will talk to him as though I am an evolutionist, asking him a Christian certain questions, and that hopefully will assist you if you're a Christian and you're looking for a way to converse with people that are evolutionists. And I think I need to remind even Christians that if there's no evidence for evolution, there's no evidence for theistic evolution. So we need to remember that. So I will jump in. And so, Herb, my question to you is, why do Christians hold to a young Earth when all the data tells us that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old?
Well, I want to clarify that first of all. You say, why do all the Christians hold to a young Earth? And
Oh,
that's just not true. There are,
you're right. I'm sorry. I meant all the, all the
yeah.
atheists, anyways. As a matter of fact, um, NASA says it's 4.6 billion years old. So how are you to differ with NASA? Are Christians just anti-scientific? I guess that's a good question, right?
Well, that's an unfair accusation that I think is made quite often. Um, why do we hold to a young Earth? Because most of the evidence points to a young Earth, believe it or not. I think it's like 90% of the evidence for a young Earth, old Earth points to a young Earth. And the methodology used for coming to the conclusion that the Earth is old it's just not sound. And I know that a lot of institutions and a lot of very well respected people hold to that, and it astonishes me, to be quite honest with you. They estimate the age of the Earth to be roughly 4.25 to 4.5 billion years old. And the reason for that is because they dated a meteor using radiometric techniques, and they got that age from the meteor. Now, the meteor is believed to be a remnant of when our solar system was formed, and if our solar system was formed roughly 4.5 billion years ago, thus the Earth must be 4.5 billion years old. Okay, fine and good. But if we look at the methodology that they use, the radiometric dating, it's obviously flawed. We can go into that a little bit. You look at the different methods they use, and there are quite a number of them. Very common ones like uranium lead, that's one of them that they use, and potassium argon. And what they do is they start with a parent element, and potassium would be a parent element. And potassium over time breaks down into argon. The half-life of that is it's just like 1.5 billion years old. What the exact is, I can't recall, but it's about 1.5 billion years old. So if we look at half-lives of potassium, we should see in 1.5 billion years that half of the potassium has been broken down. And we have a daughter element that we'd see as a result being argon. So the ratio of the potassium to the argon is used to establish a date. What the starting point is, we don't know. It's a guess, and that's just the truth. It's a guess. The argon, we don't know how much argon was in that. It's a guess. In theory, if you look at it, it's a wonderful idea, and it should be just like an hourglass, a calibrated hourglass, and you should be able to look at it and tell exactly the time. The problem is that it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like in a laboratory situation. There's contamination all the time, and we know that to be true. If you look at an explanation of these in a scientific journal, they will tell you, and I've read it myself, where they say these rates, the decay rates, are constants. They're not affected by heat, pressure, water. They're just a constant at all times. We know that that's not true. We have evidence that suggests it's not true. And the best way to do a calibration of this is to use it on something that you know the age of. And it has been tested on things that we know the age of. Mount St. Helens, for one. We know that that happened in 1980. Radiometric dating methods used to date that have shown dates in the millions of years. An uncommon one that's used as an example was a lava flow in the Hawaiian Islands that happened in the 1800s sometime, like 1870, around there. And that's been shown to be millions of years old, with quite a range in there. Why, if it fails on known ages, why are they so adamant in accepting the ages that it produces in long ages that we don't know? It seems to me that we have a little bit of a calibration error, and we can't accept these ages. Another problem with them is that tells you that the rates are not constant is the presence of radio halos. Radio halos are little round dark circles that'll show up in the rock. And that's the result of the process of breaking down. Now, that can happen at today's rates, but it takes billions of years for that to happen. So we shouldn't see any radio halos in a rock layer that's considered to be a couple million years old, say. There should be nothing there. But we see them. The way that these would form earlier is if the rates changed. It would have to be tremendously accelerated for these radio halos to form. And the fact that we see them tells us that the rock that they're calling a billion years old cannot possibly be a billion years old. Yet they hang on to it. And I don't know why. This is not disputable. There are flaws in these processes, and yet they hang on to them, and they'll go and they'll date a rock and they stick to it as though we have no reason to come against it at all.
Well,
I don't understand that.
you know, on the NASA page where it talked about the age of the Earth and the age of the universe, they gave radiometric dating as one of the ways that they know how old it is. Now you're saying that the radiometric dating is not accurate. I guess whether it's either one, right? Potassium argon or uranium lead or whatever, or even if you used carbon dating methods. And so if that's the case, and you're saying, which I understand, you're saying, look, I don't know why. I don't know why they are using those dating methods. As a person that believes in evolution, we would say that they're accurate. And what can you? Well, I guess your evidence that that they are not always accurate is the fact that they've tested them on known aged rocks and found them to fail. Right? That's
correct.
And now, do you know scientists that believe that the Earth is young based on their knowledge of either geology or any other measurement that would be used in any other scientific discipline?
I do. I know of one who is he's a tremendous geologist. His name is Andrew Snelling, and he does a lot of work in this area. And another guy, one of his colleagues, Steve Austin, same thing. And these guys, believe me, these guys are on top of their game, and they have to be on top of their game more so than most geologists would be, because they are constantly being attacked for this. Unsuccessfully, I might add. There's nobody that can prove them wrong. They've done a lot of work in this. I read their stuff, and they give reasons why these techniques don't work, and I think they're very valid reasons. And like I just said, I mean, the presence of radio halos, that just, it tells you that this can't be. It can't be accurate. And there's so many different methods of aging the Earth, and so many are just disregarded. But these radiometric datings, they're giving them the results that they want. In other words, if you hold on to evolution, you better have a long time period. You better go way back in the past, billions of years. If you don't have that, the whole thing falls apart. It falls apart anyway, but it falls apart. You need those long years. So this must be true. They take that. In other words, they're cherry picking. This gives them the information they want. The fact that it doesn't work, the fact that it fails in so many areas, they just disregard that. I mean, it's just that simple. This is not disputable. They choose what they want.
So last time we talked, you mentioned a guy named David Berlinski. Did he get into anything like that?
No, David Berlinski doesn't. As far as I know, I don't know of any research he does in that area. No, he's not a geologist.
He's just against the mechanisms of Darwinism.
Right. He's a mathematician. He looks at it mathematically, and he just sees, when the odds get to a certain point, like 1 times 10 to the 100th, he says that's getting into mathematically impossible. It's just not.
So how come Christians that believe in a young Earth, so they will oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes they'll look at the geologic column, right, the fossil record, as the results of the flood, and not the results of basically a timetable. And why can't we look at it as a timetable, which would tell us that the Earth is over 4 billion years old?
As far as a timetable, it really fails. And when you look at that and you see the expanse over which these layers cover, they're tremendous, and they had to be laid down by a tremendous amount of water at one time. Their evenness, and also what you would look at in between the layers, if they were laid down, as the evolutionists would say, over great periods of time, you'd have a layer down and would be exposed for quite some time, and you would see a lot of erosion in between layers. We're not seeing any erosion at all. We're seeing just, razor sharp edges, one on top of another. This is indicating that they were laid down very quickly, one on top of another. One layer came in, covered a massive area. Another one came in on top of it very quickly. And there are other indications there too that they were laid down quickly.
When you say a massive area, what kind of area are you talking about?
Well, we're talking about there are regions out west that cover, multi-states, hundreds of miles. We also see intercontinental layers that go from, the United States and go all the way over into Europe. They continue on over there. We see the same layer.
Same layer of rock.
It was same layer of rock, yeah. Just continues intercontinentally. That's telling us there were massive amounts of water all at one time. And certainly, I don't think anybody would argue that was caused by a local flood, because there was nothing local about it. Now, getting into that, we understand that showing that there was a worldwide flood at one time does not prove that the Earth is young, but it also shows that these layers that they use to show deep time and billions of years, that does not, these layers don't justify that. So,
Well, how do you think that why do you think that evolutionists um, date the layers so old?
well, it fits with their desires. They, like I said earlier, they have to have deep time. They have to have billions of years. Um,
But in other words, how do
to
they
look
come
at,
up? How do they come up with the fact that, um, this particular layer is, I don't know, 200 million years old? How would they figure that out?
well, radiometric dating, for one thing, they use that. And also, another thing, we get into some circular reasoning because they find fossils in certain layers and they say these fossils are this old because of the layer that we found them in. We know that layer to be, say, 200 million years old. So the fossils that are found in it must be 200 million years old. Also, we can check how old that layer is because the fossils that we found in it are 200 million years old. So that's another
So,
method they use of
so
dating
the,
it. So
so the, so you're saying that evolutionists don't have an outside objective source for dating.
they really don't. You know, radiometric dating is really the thing that they go by. That's the main thing that they go by.
And
And of
and
course, you know,
and you believe that that's inaccurate.
I know it's inaccurate. I don't think it's gone beyond just an opinion. It's inaccurate. Now, one might say, okay, the radiometric dating of this says that it's 250 million years old, say. And creationists are saying that the Earth is only a few thousand or 6,000 years old. Well, that's a tremendous difference. So if the radiometric dating is inaccurate, still the discrepancy is just tremendous. So how are we getting, you know, maybe it's off, but it's not off by that much. Well, I believe that it is because I think, you know, like I said, that the presence of the radio halo says it tells us that the acceleration rate was tremendously increased. So, and also, you know, as I also said, we can look at things of unknown ages. And Mount St. Helens, which was some 40 years ago, being dated at in the millions of years, we know that it's grossly erroneous
So
and
things show an older age, is what you're saying.
much older than they really are. Yeah,
Now, is that based on
yeah.
certain assumptions, or how would they know? How would they know how to measure it in the first place then?
Well, they don't. They can establish the rate like of potassium decay into argon. They can establish a half life, and they're assuming that the clock within the rock itself is set at zero. That there's potassium and that there's no argon. Now we know from experience, like the eruption at Mount St. Helens, we know from the gas that was coming up from that eruption, we know that it has argon in it. And this argon, through the gas and steam, it's penetrating into the rocks and depositing argon into them. And because of that, we're going to get an erroneous reading. We know that to be true. We know that uranium can be washed around in rocks from groundwater. We know that to be true. And it just, you know, makes them inaccurate. It's just in nature, this is going to happen. We don't know what we're measuring. We don't know how much was in there or not in there. We don't know if we tip an hourglass over and we start it up. We don't know for sure if somebody came into the room and tipped it back for a little while and then turned it back again. We don't know that for sure. That's what we're dealing with here. So
So, if there was a flood, like Christians believe, then would the flood have affected the rocks in any way?
The flood would have a tremendous effect on it. The pressure that would be created, the washing waters would have an effect on it, and we would see a tremendously accelerated rate of decay. The flood lasted for a year. Um, it was not it was not a flood like some people have, where the water just kind of gradually rises up and then after a year recedes back down again. It was very stormy, tremendous waves coming over. It was just it made a mess of things, in other words, and all those clocks were just thrown off. And now what we're seeing today is what we might expect to see. We might see that these dates that are given to us by the rock are tremendously erroneous because of that.
Is there anything that would correlate outside of radiometric dating for for the age of rocks, essentially? Is there anything that would correlate either to say this shows that they are old or this shows that they're not old? In other words, other measurements that can be drawn on to confirm one way or the other?
You really can't do that. You don't know the history of the rock. You don't know when it was last molten. In other words, setting the clock at zero again. They they really rely on these radiometric dates to put an age on the rocks. Um,
But I mean things like
you can say,
things outside of dating the rocks. Are there other like any like other measurement methods like I mean the Earth has electromagnetism and other things. Would they confirm or deny old or young?
well, the electromagnetism of it's the decay rate was measured, I don't know, around 1850 or so, and from the decay that we've seen over the last 160 years would indicate that this could only last for 10,000 years. So that's kind of hard to say. They speculate different things. Where some say that, well, it gets recharged by a dynamo in the center of the Earth. In other words, the molten center of the Earth can can recharge it over time, like the magnetism can reverse. And some say that it has done this several times in Earth's history. Um, some have speculated if there was a global flood that it would have happened multiple times during that flood. And but as we know it right now, the uh, the indication is that electromagnetism is that it's a young Earth and could not last more than 10,000 years. So if it was older than 10,000 years, we'd have no electromagnetism in the Earth right now. Is that what you're getting at? Like,
Well, I guess I'm asking you if there's other methods like that that would tell us. You said 90% of the dating methods would tell us that we have a young
right.
Earth. So,
Well,
um,
some other ones are like, the saliation of our oceans. I think the saliation rate, as it stands right now, the saliation rate would indicate that the Earth is, if I remember correctly, like 60 million years old. And so even that's kind of high. But if we throw a global flood in there, we can see that the salination rate would have increased quite a bit during that time. There's a global flood. The oceans and the land were all underwater, and that was mixing in together. The sedimentation on the floor of the ocean indicates that the Earth is about 12 million years old. Same thing. Only 12 million years old, but we can see that it would have been accelerated during the worldwide flood. That's another indication of a younger Earth.
so the flood
Um,
the flood plays um, sounds like a key role in whether or not the measurements um, the measurements can be trusted because if there really was a flood, then because of its global nature and the global impact of it, it sounds like it would have ruined the ability to measure backwards at a consistent rate and be accurate.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely did. You know, these dating methods are all askew now as a result of that, and that's what we would expect. If we had a global flood, we'd expect them to not be accurate. Again, and I want to emphasize the idea of it and discovering this was quite a thing. It's a great idea, radiometric dating. But the problem is that it really can't be used because we would say so, believing what the Bible tells us in Genesis. We would say, wait a minute, guys, you can't do this because the whole earth was underwater 4,500 years ago. That's going to throw everything off. But if you don't believe that, and you say, no, this will work because that never happened, and you go out there and you use these things, and now we're seeing the problems as we just discussed, you'd understand that something happened. Something's wrong here. We see evidence that something happened, that it's not right here. Again, I go back to the fact that we test these things on things of known age, and they don't work. We can go into carbon-14 dating. Carbon-14, it's a very common thing. It's not used on deep ages like that because it can only be used on living things that have carbon-14 in them. Carbon-14 is a good one, actually, to talk about and kind of get an idea how this dating method works. Carbon-14 is an isotope of carbon. The vast majority of carbon that we have in our atmosphere is carbon-12. But the sun's energy sometimes comes in and it messes with that carbon-12 a bit, and we get carbon-14. Carbon-14 is different than carbon-12 because you have a stable element in carbon-12, meaning that you have an equal number of protons and neutrons, 6 and 6 of each one. Well, in carbon-14, you have 8 neutrons. That's unstable. Carbon-14 is not nearly as common as carbon-12, but is in the atmosphere. And because it's charged, it's going to decay. And we can use that in a dating method because it has a half-life. Now, the carbon-14 in the environment is taken in by plants from photosynthesis. So they have the carbon-14 in them. Animals eat the plants, so they get the carbon-14. Other animals eat those animals that ate the plants, so now they have the carbon-14 in them. We already discussed all plants have carbon-14 in them. So when an animal dies, we know it has carbon-14 in it, and getting a ratio of carbon-14, which has a half-life of 5,700 years, 5,730, I think, to be exact. So from a starting point, we know we have carbon-14, and that degrades. It's radioactive. And it degrades into nitrogen-14, which is stable. So we get that ratio. And supposedly, you can get a date of how old something is. And I think it works pretty well within a certain time period. But if you go longer, then things start to get askew. Things are not working out right. And we know this for a fact because some animals that have been dated using the carbon-14 method, and this is true, an animal being tested, sample taken from the front of the animal, sample taken from the back of the same animal, and they had vastly different ages, thousands of years different. And that should tell you right there that something is wrong there. But I think out of all of them, my belief is that the carbon-14 within more recent times is the most accurate. So as far as going into deep time, I don't think that those radiometric dating methods are really worth anything, in my opinion.
Well, we wouldn't believe that there was a flood because that would make the Earth too young, and evolution can't occur in that short a time, so it had to be older.
So it had a what?
Be older. Has to be older.
Yeah,
It won't work
yeah,
shorter.
yeah.
It,
Well, you know what? We've talked about some of the dating methods for an old Earth, and we're putting our faith in those things, despite the fact that we have shown for everybody to see that there are flaws in these dating methods. We talked about some of the things that would indicate a young Earth. I think one of the big ones is in recent times, Mary Schweitzer discovered some red blood cells in a T Rex bone. Schweitzer's dangerous discovery, as it's become known as. And since her discovery of red blood cells, there have been many more discoveries in such bones and many other mammals of supposed old age. They found soft tissue and ligaments and such things. And I think it's funny that the reaction is, oh, well, I guess they do survive for millions of years. We know that they don't. We know that they don't. And, there are a lot of little things like that. I shouldn't say a little thing. That's a big thing that indicates that the dinosaur bones are not the millions of years old that we have supposed for all these years. And I'll tell you another big one that I found fascinating. I just recently read a book by Nathaniel Jeanson called Traced. And in the book, he traces the Y chromosome. And this is very interesting. In tracing the Y chromosome, he looks into different haplogroups, in other words, similar chromosomes in groups of people. He traces it back to a bottleneck in the population from 3 different haplogroups. Now, those 3 different haplogroups over time, they spread out and formed a lot more groups. I thought it was interesting that he traced back 4,500 years ago 3 haplogroups. And we look at the story in Genesis of Noah's flood. The entire Earth, population of the Earth was wiped out, except for Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. We got 3 groups there, which would represent each one of Noah's daughters-in-law. I thought that was interesting. It doesn't say that. That's just.
So let me get this straight. So you actually believe that there was a flood, and you believe that Noah existed?
Oh, I absolutely do. Yeah, yeah. And the more I look into it, the more convinced I am of it. Now, let me finish with these haplogroups and the Y chromosome. There was a study done to find out the origination of this human Y chromosome. And the study concluded that the Y chromosome was roughly 200,000 years old. But they refined the study. They made improvements to it. And using this new improved study, they redid it using new techniques that were better. And they came up with this Y chromosome. This is secular science now that's doing this. They came up with the conclusion that the human race was 6,000 years old. Well, they weren't going to have that. They liked the old study better. It didn't have the improvements. And they kept filtering it and filtering it, making adjustments to it until the new study agreed with the old study. Back to 200,000 years. I thought that was fascinating. I think that the Y chromosome being shown to be 6,000 years old and also showing a bottleneck at 4,500 years, coming back to 3 haplogroups from 3 different women. It doesn't say that in the Bible. It just says that there were 3 women of childbearing years. I thought that was quite fascinating.
Well, but then
That's just the
but then
science.
they fixed the study and got back to evolution the way we needed to, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what they did. Yeah, I think it's fascinating, and
So what
it
do
was a
you
wonderful book.
what do you think is the um, you think just that there were some dinosaurs that secretly lived a really long time and just died recently?
I think dinosaurs have been around a lot more recently than we've been led to believe, and I think one of the things, is just about every society has stories of dragons. The term dinosaur is a fairly new thing. Um, People back then referred to these creatures as dragons. And these stories are so widespread in different cultures that had no connection with one another that you have to at least look into it. And it's my belief that these creatures lived with man in relatively recent times. What happened to them, I don't know. I don't know why we don't see anymore, but I believe that Noah took them on board with him, some juveniles, and they were alive in post-flood years. And I remember seeing a picture one time. It was a medieval painting of a king in his court, and they had a small dinosaur in the court, and they had chains on him. So they were trying to control him. And what was interesting about this picture is not just they had a picture of a dinosaur in the king's court, but it had markings on its skin. Um, Nobody had any idea about dinosaurs or what they might have looked like or any markings around the skin. All we find now is fossils, just the bones. We don't know about that. Well, in fairly recent times, they dug up some fossilized skin, and it had the markings of this dinosaur that was in the painting. And I thought that was fascinating. I don't know, you know, how that came to be, how they would know this. Um, I mean, they had a painting of the actual creature with that skin and the same markings on the skin. How would they have known that? Just food for
Well,
thought.
well, they um, they couldn't have
Yeah.
unless they actually saw one, right? I mean, I don't know if they were
Well, that
digging
would be
up
the
fossils
conclusion.
back then.
Yeah. Getting back to the flood again, I know I shared this with you before. Um, my wife and I recently took a trip out west, and one of our stops that we did was to the Grand Canyon. And I specifically remember standing there looking out at the Grand Canyon. And my first thought was all the pictures that I've seen of this do not do it justice. There's something that being there in person and seeing it with your own eyes takes in something that the camera is not able to take in. And upon standing there, I also had the thought, if I were just standing here as I am now, having no knowledge of evolution or of the Bible and what it said, and I had two people come to me, and one proposed to me the evolutionary process of how this Grand Canyon was formed, and somebody else proposed to me, well, there's a biblical story of a great flood. Which one would I find more reasonable? And as I looked down at the Colorado River in the far distance, and the evolutionist was explaining to me how that river carved out this canyon over millions of years. And the other one told me, no, this was done by a global flood. And the draining waters from that flood, massive amounts of water rushing off the land, dug this canyon out. And I would have sit and think about what both of these people had said to me. Well, which one would be more reasonable? There's no question in my mind that the biblical account is the more reasonable explanation of why we see what we see. And then when you look into it more closely and you see the layers that you see, layer upon layer, was this gradual over time, or was this laid down quickly in a short period of time? I think that the laid down quickly in a short period of time makes much more sense. And
Now,
we just try to look at it as reasonably as we can.
now you mentioned earlier that there's no evidence of erosion between rock layers. Did you see any evidence of erosion when you were at the Grand Canyon?
No, no. I see the same thing like when Andrew Snelling does his videos and he points this out as he walks through and he points it out. And I say, yeah, yeah, that's very true. Another big thing that he points out, hard to explain for a secular scientist, is when we see these massive bends in the rock. You know, have you ever seen pictures of that where it curves? And sometimes you see like a 90-degree angle in it. There's no cracking there. It's just a smooth bend, no cracking at all. Now, I would ask you, how does that happen over millions of years of time um, with just pressure without any crack? It never cracks. How do you explain that? Or is it more reasonable to say, well, that happened when it was wet mud and these folds developed, and then it hardened after that? What's more reasonable? Did it slowly dry over millions of years? Or, you know,
Well, you never know what
I
time
really
can
have to
bring,
try to
huh?
be reasonable. What's that?
You never know what time can bring.
Mm,
Time is the
yeah.
hero of the plot.
Well, you know, there's an interesting story about that, and I think we've talked before, and that Andrew Snelling, upon noticing these folds, and he just said, it just spoke very clearly to him what had happened. And he thought to himself, surely where those folds are, surely somebody has tested the rocks in those areas to see if there's any chemical difference, because if there was heat or pressure applied to these, there would be a chemical change and it would indicate such. But the thing that got him was that there's no cracks. How can that happen? Well, an evolutionist might tell you, when they do, they say, well, over time, the heat and the pressure, or the heat caused by the pressure, can can make that fold very slowly over time. Well, such a heat, as Andrew Snelling pointed out, would cause a chemical change. So he decided to do what nobody else had done. And he was going to take samples of where the fold was, right in the fold, and he was going to take samples at distances from the fold, various distances along the way. And he would analyze the samples that he took to see if there was a difference. And if there was heat in there, he would be able to tell that at the fold, we have a different chemical composition than what we have further away from the fold. And there's a big story that we need not get into here about him trying to get in there, and they knew who he was, and they did not want him in there. And there was a big court case, him saying that they had no right to keep him out. He had every right to be in there just as much as any other archaeologist, but they didn't want, they knew who he represented and what he wanted to do. Well, finally, he won his case and he was able to get in there and get these samples. He found that there was no chemical difference between where you see the fold and any distance that he took away from the fold. It was all the same, indicating that these folds happened while it was wet. It was mud. And that tells you if this was this big fold in a thick layer of rock was all wet at the same time, this was not laid down over millions of years. It was a pretty sudden thing.
Now,
So,
now what you're implying is that evolutionary geologists would attempt to prevent a creation geologist from doing any kind of analysis either A, because they're afraid of the findings, or B, they don't want um, something artificial published. I mean, they really can't, I mean, there might be some other motivations, but I would, assuming the best from scientists, that it's got to be one or the other. Either they're afraid of the findings, or, because they will dislodge their own belief, or they don't want the findings out because they will misrepresent the truth. But if the findings are accurate and they're different from what evolutionists believe to be true, um, then the dislodging of the evolutionary scenario should be something that's welcome, but for some reason it's not. Correct?
That's correct. The reasons for the protection of the current theories are varied. Um, People want to believe what they want to believe. There's been a lot of work, a lot of publications about this. People have gotten famous over this. They're very well respected for the work that they do. And to come out and say, we had it all wrong for all of these years, we've had it all wrong. That's kind of a big thing. And nobody wants to do that. And they're protecting themselves from that. Now, I'm not saying that all archaeologists are doing this. I think that young people going into the field are just indoctrinated. They go to school for it, they learn this thing, and of course, what they're learning is true. These are tried and tested professors they have that are working out in the field and have been for some time. They're not going to be wrong about this. And besides that, all of their peers and everybody around them believes the same thing. Andrew Snelling is a rogue. He's crazy. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's probably just trying to make a name for himself by being different. He's rattling the cage, so to speak, and getting known. And that's the way they look at it. But I'm just asking, I just ask the people, just look at it with an open mind. Just let the science say what the science says. That's all I'm saying. I'm not denying science. I'm a huge fan of science. I love science. I'm very interested in it. I'm not afraid of it. I embrace it, but I just ask that it can speak and that the scientists would not speak for it. Just let it say what it has to say.
Evolutionists have a tendency to think that creationists are science deniers. What would you say to that?
Well, I hear that all the time. That we're science deniers. We're not science deniers. Some of the I would say absolutely the greatest scientists in the history of the world have been Christians. We can't deny that. Christians are encouraged to get into science. We're commanded by Peter in the Bible to give account for our faith. That means know your science. Basically, that's what he's saying. Know why you believe what you believe. So we look at it very seriously. We take it very seriously. And we're not to misrepresent it. We're to tell it as it is. And we look at it. Now, I'm not a scientist myself. I just have an interest in it. And I've read quite a lot about it. And I read both sides, as I often tell you. I read both sides. I try to hear what both sides are saying, and I just let it speak to me. And when we go into things like radiometric dating, I am not going to just swallow it because people say this is how old the Earth is, and we have these methods to tell us. And to deny that is to deny science. No, I'm denying your methodology. That's what I'm denying. And I would ask people that when they're doing proper science, the scientific method is calling for us to be open for all things. And if that means there's a supernatural being that created all of this, if that's a possibility, then we need to be open to that as well. But I find that many scientists today, certainly not all of them, and probably not even the majority, are closing off to that. They won't even look at that as a possibility. And I think that's unfortunate, and I think that they're not doing proper science by doing that.
Now,
So,
so um, if what you're saying is true, in other words, if the Earth isn't as old as radiometric dating has been interpreted by evolutionary scientists to tell us, and if there actually was a global flood, which would have interrupted the geologic calendar, in a sense, if you will, and it was really laid down, the layers of sediment were really laid down by a global flood as opposed to um, millions of years, little by little, um, then that would also support the flood story in the Bible. And I know Christians are always saying that the Bible's a historical document, um, and have reasons that they believe that they can validate it as such. So if 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 the age of the earth is young, not only does that eliminate the possibility of evolution, but it also um, it affects the age of the universe, correct? Because the solar system is believed to be tied to the age of the Earth being in
right,
our solar system.
4.5 billion years or whatever they say. Oh,
So all these things have an impact. They all connect together. It's like if you break the chain, in other words, you can't have evolution 6 to 10,000 years. Won't work.
right,
And you
right,
certainly can't have evolution if God created everything, because then everything would have been made as a complete organism, and it wouldn't have kind of randomly find its way to come together through natural selection.
right. And it would be, as we see today, that each kind would produce after its own kind. And that's what we see.
So, one final question before we end. So, is there any evidence, since we're talking about rocks and rock layers and the fossils in rock layers to some extent and dating, um, is there any evidence in your mind? And I'll ask you this, I'm out of the evolutionary character at this point, but is there any evidence, Herb, that you know of that would actually connect um, any two species together other than homology, which things just appear to be similar because they have similar DNA characteristics or physical characteristics, or arms, legs, or whatever. Um, aside from homology, the things just look the same, because that could be the fingerprints of the same maker. But um, same with DNA, right? You get the same fingerprints of the same creator. But is there anything, anywhere that you're aware of, that an evolutionist can point to and say, this species or family of um, family of animal or whatever is has been shown and seen and understood to be connected to this one, which is a different species or a different, has a different body type or whatever. In other words, evolutionists believe that lizards turned into birds. I mean, I've actually read evolutionary books. I thought it was a joke at first, but they think that some scientists thought that lizards kept jumping off cliffs or falling off and then kept waving their arms and dying until after millions of years, um, like wings started to form or something. I mean, I just, there's obviously no evidence for that. I mean, I don't even know why evolutionists would believe that lizards turned into birds. There's not enough similarity. They don't have similarity in bones. The bones of birds are hollow, and the lung structure for breathing while you're flying, all these things are different, and they can't, it's not like they changed incrementally over millions of years. And what would be the necessity of change?
I think that's interesting. Lizards jumping off of cliffs until they formed wings, and that's what saved them, I guess. So they became birds. I never heard that one before, but
I actually read
that's
that.
pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and we can accept that and take that as serious science. But if you want to talk about a global flood, that's absolutely absurd. Okay, but anyway, getting back to your question about two different types, I guess, or species that would be related. And as far as evolution goes, an evolutionist, I think, would be quick to say in response to that, yes, humans and chimps. They would say that they're very, very closely related. They share 96% of the same DNA until you go and look into it a little bit more. And they're very different. Two entirely different things. They do not share a common ancestor. Um, you might say that they share homology, but I don't think that that's very good because we share homology with a lot of different animals, and I think that's speaking to a good design that works well and a good idea by a common creator. They look at some of the chromosomes, and there's a broken chromosome that we share with chimps, and this couldn't possibly be. It had to have been from an evolutionary process. Well, I know Stephen Meyer has said that he doesn't believe that that's a broken chromosome. That's the way it's supposed to be in both humans and chimps, but that
Did
does not
did
indicate the
did
common
he
ancestor.
did he write on that in Signature of the Cell?
Might have been in that. I don't recall where it was, but I do know that he somewhere he suggested that. And no, aside from that, no, I don't see any. I personally, no, I don't see anything that can compare in a different kind of animal. We can look at elk and deer and see similarities there. I'm sure that they would point that out to you, but that's the same kind of animal. And
So then you know, I guess if the connection, so the connection is always just assumed. Because, I mean, look, we're old enough that we watched a lot of movies many years ago where they were always, even the Three Stooges were looking for the missing link, right?
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
Nobody's ever really found the missing link with all the additional fossil finds, but um, you know, like the, so the search for the missing link is the search for the connection between the branch to apes and humans.
yeah.
A- And but if you don't have it and you just assume it, how is that science?
Uh, it's not. Charles Darwin himself, when he came up with this theory, again, we can't overemphasize that he thought that life was a pretty simple thing, and he had no idea the complexity of the cell. Never mind DNA, the complexity of DNA. But he thought that in time we would find a complete fossil record showing incremental changes of a species over time, and how we would see very clearly how one type of animal morphed into another kind of animal, slow changes over time. We've never found that. And it's very rare that they even find a fossil, or they'll even make the claim that this is a transitional form. Now, some evolutionists say, "What do you mean we haven't found any transitional forms? Every time we find a fossil, it's a transitional form because evolution is an ongoing process. So every fossil you find is a transition from another kind." But that's evading the
Well,
question. We want to
that
see.
that's that's putting evolution into an unfalsifiable position.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. But you would think, I'm going to be fair with them. We know that evolution, if true, is a very slow, gradual process. But they find these fossils, and sometimes they claim it to be a transitional form, like Tiktaalik, supposed to be a land, like an amphibious creature. And they say this was a go between fish and a mammal on the earth. And it's just, I mean, you look at it and you just say, no, you have to want to accept that, you know. Um, but no, we don't see the transitional forms. I will probably get comments that we have transitional forms all over the place, but it's just the truth. We don't see them, and the ones that we see are drawings in museums and things that are made out of plaster or whatever.
Creative,
Supposed
yeah.
this is what the transition. Yeah, but no, we don't see that. There is no record of evolution. We just don't see it. There's no mechanism for evolution. There's no reason to accept evolution as a real thing.
Now, I
I
think
don't want to get into evolution.
yeah, I think the reason that they push for the lizard turning into a bird is because the birds were found higher in the fossil layer than the lizards.
Yeah,
But that
yeah.
would have been normal in a flood scenario, wouldn't it?
Well, in a flood scenario, you would expect to find large groups of animals all washed down into the same place, and that's what we find.
Oh, you mean fossil
We find what is
graveyards?
it? Fossil graveyards. What do they all just happen to go there and die together? I think that's kind of unusual. But
But I mean,
if we had a global flood,
in the higher fossil layers, birds
yeah,
would be expected to survive a little longer than everything else, and when they die, they float anyways. So
yeah,
they would
yeah,
be expected to be taken by some of the sludge a little bit higher.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So a
But
lot of the location of, and they're not all equal. Like it's not like you can go to any place in the world, cut a mountain in half, and all the fossil layers are the same. They say they're different because of the tectonic plate shifting, um, but they've
yeah,
kept them pretty well intact for doing that. And if that's the
yeah,
case, and but if you look at the bottom of the fossil layer, with clams and mollusks and things like that, and then the top with birds, um, you know, it seems to speak more of mobility during a flood than it does of a time scale for development. Would you agree with that?
yeah, yeah. I do agree with that. As you're talking about the flood and these layers and all. And I think an interesting point we have to bring up is that we see large areas that have sand dunes, fossilized sand dunes that are now rock. What's interesting about that, and you just kind of jarred my memory about that, and I just like to bring it out. On land, sand dunes form, but when they form on land, they have angles that are in the 40-degree range, and they can solidify into rock in that position. Underwater, they form differently, and they're like 15 to 25 degrees. That's just something that's observed in observational science. And we see underwater that, you know what I'm talking about, the ripples
Yep.
that you see, like if you're running water over, they'll come out to be 15 to 25 degrees. When we look at the sand dunes and the geological layers, like down underneath, we see 15 to 25 degrees. These were formed underwater. Massive amounts of water. Obviously, it was massive amounts of water. And I think that's somewhat telling, yet ignored. Again, and I just think that's a nice little tidbit to throw out there. But quite an evidence for a global flood, I would say. But,
Well, as you mentioned earlier, I mean, they've found rock deposits and sediments that have really spanned across the continent of the United States and
yeah,
then over into Europe and stuff like
yeah,
that. I don't know how that would even possibly be explained, um, other than uh, through a massive deluge, because it just doesn't happen with little. Well, first of all, little trickling rivers and even big rivers. I mean, some of the
yeah.
biggest rivers in the world, they don't do that.
Yeah, I mean, like we were talking about earlier, you look down into the Grand Canyon, you see that Colorado River way down there in the distance to where you can barely see it. And in some places you can't see it. And have it explained to you that that river carved this this
Massive
canyon out
canyon.
over great areas.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And you're supposed to just say, "Oh, wow, wow, water and time. Wow, isn't
Well,
that
again,
something?"
we've talked a lot about you have to start with the evidence that you have, and that's the effect. And you have to work back to cause, right? So if
Yeah,
I find most of the fossils that exist up on top of the continent, and they're you know uh, fossils that should be in the water, right? From uh, you know things that lived in the water, but they're up on top of the continents. It's easy to say that the water at one point washed up there, but not for the tremendous amount of fossils, nor for the height and the height of the continents. And again, if you were to say, okay, there was a global flood, right, like huge deluge that shook the whole earth, and it was like massive tsunamis everywhere, right? Um,
yeah,
then that would much more account for what we actually have than um, these minuscule, slow, gradual changes over millions of years. And, I remember talking to you one time and saying, what do you like? What could possibly be the reason that people think that, like, all these layers, I mean, that go uh, thousands of feet into the earth, where'd all the sediment come from?
yeah,
I mean, it it
yeah,
it is the Earth, and if it was just tectonic plates, that doesn't really answer that question.
yeah.
You know what I mean? I
Well,
just,
there's so much is just ignored. It's not even addressed. And that's all. That's all we're asking. Pay attention to this stuff and address it. Give your explanation.
yeah. So next week, um, we should address the question of um, why Christians would actually believe the Bible itself, right? Like, like, I
Sure.
mean, there are so many people that don't believe the Bible for unfortunately ridiculous reasons, but maybe we should go into some reasons um, why the Bible is actually um, it is evidence itself, as well as it has evidence to support it, because it is a piece of evidence. It's a historical document.
Yeah.
You know, how's that sound?
Sounds good.
All right.
Sounds
Well,
great.
yep. Well, if you've stayed with us this long, we appreciate it. We're a little over an hour, but we'll be back hopefully next week, the Lord willing, and then we'll talk about that. We'll talk about evidence for the Bible, and the Bible itself really as evidence. So until then, may God richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.